On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I thank you for participating in the Transit Asset Management Principles for Large Bus Paratransit Systems webinar. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Our speakers are Scott Baker and Bob Brownstein. Scott Baker is a senior consulting manager with AECOM. He has extensive experience in investment planning for major transportation systems, business process improvement, strategic, operational, and information technology systems, organizational assessment and review, financial planning for transportation entities, and innovative contracting. Mr. Baker has a combination of national consulting experience on major transit issues and hands-on experience based on years of line responsibility for operations and asset management at San Antonio's Via Metropolitan Transit and Pittsburgh Port Authority of Allegheny County. He is adept at integrating agency service, project, fleet, facility, technology, financial, and labor relations planning. His experience as a line manager responsible for rail and bus operations and asset management has been applied in 2 recent projects to formulate advice to FTA on asset management and to develop the National Transit Institute's Introduction to Transit Asset Management training programs. Robert Brownstein is a vice president at AECOM and a senior consulting manager in the transportation consulting practice of AECOM. He is an internationally recognized transit expert with over 38 years' experience in the public transportation industry. He has particular expertise in project development, information technology, maintenance, operations, procurement, and materials management. Prior to joining the private sector, Mr. Brownstein was a senior official with the New Jersey Transit Corporation. In addition to financial and capital program-related positions, he served for 10 years as the Director of Procurement, responsible for purchasing, contracting administration, materials management, and distribution. I will now turn the call over to Scott.
This webinar series began with a first of 2 sequential webinars on June 13th. The second in the series of 2 webinars being presented in 3 versions. Yesterday we presented one for small agencies. Today we have the large bus and paratransit webinar, and tomorrow a version for agencies with rail services, and those 3 are very similar. These will not include information about MAP 21. You'll see some allusion to FTA pre-MAP 21 requirements, particularly we did cover that on June 13th in webinar 1, but I would like to emphasize that what we're talking about is good business management practices. So the goal of the webinar is to increase an understanding of asset management theory to some extent, how it can be helpful to mass transit, and we're going to be talking about a particular school of asset management which is a little bit more advanced than I think the U.S. transit industry, in my own personal experience, practices. It is based on asset management theory that was actually developed in Australia and New Zealand, but has been widely adopted throughout the British Commonwealth, is the basis of a British standard and soon to be a basis of an international standards organization asset management standard as well. And you'll hear us mention our main authority, the International Infrastructure Management Manual, a number of times. But we are talking about asset management as a good business practice rather than the FTA requirements, and indeed FTA requirements are not known. They have not issued regulations under MAP 21 or even a notice of proposed rulemaking. They're still in that process. So we'll begin our business practices discussion with some definitions, some principles. Bob will talk about the benefits of asset management, and we'll briefly, as I said, allude to some FTA policies and talk about strategies for implementation. We're going to be focusing today on the 10 steps in the asset management planning process, which should not, again, be confused with the FTA asset management plan requirements, but are the asset management planning process that's incorporated into the International Asset Management Methodology and the International Infrastructure Management Manual. So definitions are important because although this is a somewhat new asset management methodology. As Rolando pointed out, we've all been managing assets in the transit industry for many years, and a large part of what we're doing in this methodology is common sense. The methodology, is the first definition here, says focuses on business and engineering processes. So we try to introduce some more sophisticated business and engineering, analytical, and decision-making processes to maximize the use of our resources. But it does include common sense business decision-making. The second definition on this page is interesting. It's from MAP 21. It says that asset management consists of actions that will achieve and sustain a desired state of good repair over the life cycle of the assets at a minimum practicable cost. And you'll hear that a number of times in this seminar. So the methodology is oriented towards optimizing the life cycle costs of the assets that are necessary for transit service. We're going to be talking about physical assets, not financial or liquid assets, but we do include software and IT assets. As the MAP 21 definition indicated, we talk about state of good repair as entirely different from asset management, simply being a targeted condition of the asset. And we'll talk about various IT tools and generally refer to them as enterprise asset management systems or maintenance information systems being the key systems that we use. And again, Rolando mentioned his in Long Beach. We'll talk about the asset management methodologies, asset management plan, and indeed focus on that today and the 10 steps involved in the plan as a way of communicating the overall methodology. And that's distinguished from a capital investment plan, which may include expansion in capital, but includes capital renewal and replacement. So that renewal and replacement in the capital investment plan overlaps with the asset management plan, which includes both maintenance and capital renewal and replacement as its key operational components. The principles of the asset management methodology that we're talking about are the asset management must be policy driven, often a governing board resolution, but it has to have some commitment from the top of the organization because it requires a financial discipline that reaches the highest levels of decision making and policy trade-off. So there needs to be some buy-in from the governing board, possibly even a resolution. It's performance-based, and it's based on operating results, the kinds of indicators that Rolando was talking about: availability of assets, miles between failure, reliability, on-time performance related to assets, and so forth. It evaluates options. We formulate decisions that have to be made, and we analyze the trade-off in those decisions to decide the better course of action. It's data-driven, and you'll get a lot of that in the remainder of these slides. It requires a lot of data that you trust. So you need an information system that has integrity, that you have confidence in so that you can analyze cost effectiveness, availability, reliability, and make decisions based on the data that you've collected. And it's transparent in the sense that it is based on data and analysis, so that at the end of the process, and we hope this message comes through today of all of the messages, if you had anyone question a maintenance program, a maintenance expenditure, or a capital renewal or replacement expenditure, you should, in your asset management program using this methodology, be able to demonstrate how that decision was made based on your targeted service and your data that you've collected. And you should be able to say that any deferral of maintenance or deferral of capital renewal and replacement must inevitably result either in increases in cost, because you will not have the optimal cycle of replacement or maintenance, or compromise the service. So it's based on the service and the cost, and any deviation from the optimal program will compromise one or the other. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bob Brownstein to talk about how asset management can benefit you.
Thank you, Scott. So how can asset management help you? Why are we talking about this? FTA hasn't come out with the regulations for MAP 21, so what is the purpose of developing an asset management plan if FTA doesn't require it? As Scott said earlier, and as did Rolando, it is a good business practice. It will help the agency. It will help the performance of the agency. It will lower long-term costs for asset preservation. The decisions regarding the assets are going to now be based on data. Equipment can be replaced when it's no longer cost-effective to maintain, and the data and information you need to make that determination will be readily available as part of the asset management plan. It results in more consistent performance. There'll be a lot of talk in this presentation about key performance indicators. And key performance indicators provide a target for which you design your asset management plan around. So if you're looking to achieve a certain level of performance, you will maintain and make capital investments that will result in that level of performance. So it results in a more consistent performance. It also assures safety. It is a better decision-making process. Scott made reference to transparency. Providing more transparency in how you make your maintenance and capital investment decisions help you with your funding sources. It provides a level of confidence and integrity in your decisions that the funding agents can look at, can see, can buy into, can agree with. They will know how you're making your decisions, as will your customers. Improved ability to make case for funding requests and respond to funding fluctuations. So if there is a decision by the legislators not to fund something, the results of them not funding it are readily apparent. And then consideration of agency risk. Now, what do we mean by agency risk? Putting together an asset management plan is about managing risk. So it has to do with the risk associated with or with not making an investment to achieve a certain consistent level of performance. So if I'm going to target replacing my buses at 15 years, by replacing at 15 years, is it going to cost me a lot more money to maintain those coaches? And will I get a higher level of in-service failures? And there's risks associated with that. There are 10 steps in building an asset management plan. So by the end of this, what we'll be able to do is identify the components of and how do you build a plan, identify the different roles involved in building a plan, and know how to begin the implementation process. What is required for implementation? First and foremost, it requires strong executive support. Putting together an asset management plan and implementing that plan requires buy-in throughout the organization, requires strong leadership that the organization knows that this is the path that we're going down. It's a cultural change. It is changing the way the organization makes decisions. It's changing the way the organization carries out its business. Rolando was talking earlier about it's within the maintenance organization. Yes, the maintenance organization plays a big role in it, but it involves not only maintenance, but also involves engineering. It also involves operations. It involves your finance and capital organizations. It goes throughout your organization. It has an interdisciplinary perspective, and it's a multi-year commitment. It's not something where you're changing your decisions frequently. It's a multi-year commitment that you need to plan over the long term as opposed to month to month or week to week. Implementation of improvements. It's important that in beginning an asset management plan that you recognize that there's a core program, and implementing the core program over time then matures to a more advanced program. So many agencies, what they do is they start small and then aim over time to achieve a more sophisticated program that provides more information and, frankly, better information. So the core program would begin with the preliminary inventory. A preliminary inventory is not a collection of a lot of information on every one of your assets. It may only be a collection of a sample of your assets, a sample of the condition of those assets, and over time, more information is entered into populate a record so you can make more informed decisions. So basically what it means is you're implementing your core program as you become comfortable with it, as the organization adopts the cultural change, as better information becomes available, as the organization becomes used to making decisions that way, the organization then advances to a more mature program. More mature program is long-term life cycle plans that optimize cost and risk, developing strategies and goals around performance measurements that we discussed earlier, integrated information technology systems, and strategies are risk-based. We discussed risk-based strategies earlier. The process for building an asset management plan, what we have here are the 10 steps associated with building the plan. The first step is to develop the asset inventory. That is collecting all the information that you need relative to your assets. And we're going to discuss each one of these steps as we go forward. The second step is determining the condition of the assets. Third step is determine residual life. Fourth step is determine life cycle cost. Fifth step is quality of service. Sixth is risk assessment, and so on. I think it's also important to mention here, it does not have to necessarily one step follow the next, and so on. Many of these steps can sometimes proceed concurrently. The process for building an asset management plan, there are 5 key questions. The first question is, what is the state of your assets? And steps 1 through 4 define the state of your assets. The next question is, what is required for quality of service? And this is putting in place what Rolando made reference to earlier, having to do with KPIs. Set your targets, set your service targets. You set your service targets, and then you determine what investment, both in capital in terms of maintenance and capital, it would take in order to achieve those service targets. What are the risks associated with critical to sustain performance? You assess the risk. What are the best maintenance and capital investment strategies? And we're going to discuss how do you optimize O&M expenditures as well as capital investment. And then lastly, what is the long-term financial resource and allocation strategy? And we will discuss that shortly.
So the first steps in the asset management plan process are inventory-related steps, and the first one is developing the inventory. That's where Rolando kind of started his discussion, and it is the logical place to start. As we've been saying, you're carrying on an asset management process continuously, and so these steps are not necessarily sequential, but I think you will see the logic to the sequence that was chosen. The inventory is a critical part of the asset management process overall, and I think the way that many of us have been doing capital planning illustrates the point. A common term in transit systems has been a call for projects, whereby the various departments submit capital projects, the equipment managers, asset managers submit some renewal and replacement projects along with expansion. The difference in an inventory-based system is that there's a way of answering the question, did we leave anything out? So it's important, as Rolando said, for your facilities, particularly in the non-rail systems, because facilities tend to be secondary in non-rail systems, to have a complete inventory and know that you're taking renewal and replacement decisions when they're necessary, as well as implementing the maintenance program. The first real problem you'll encounter in trying to develop an inventory, particularly a new inventory for capital purposes or for facilities, is how detailed and granular is the inventory. You'll see on this screen an example of the Washington DOT standard, which they've used in their statewide asset management planning processes, and they say that assets include all rolling stock, that is passenger vehicles, include facilities with a replacement value of $25,000 or more, and any other equipment with a replacement value of $100,000 or more. So all rolling stock and most major facilities and other equipment over $100,000. But you can come up with your own definition. An issue that's rapidly evolving in the industry is how our capital planning inventories will relate to the traditional fleet maintenance inventories that Rolando also mentioned, and that we've kept up to date in most systems pretty religiously. Content of the inventory is what you might expect. A description of the asset, the year manufactured or placed in service, the remaining useful life. Important to keep an eye on that remaining useful life. In other words, not just the accounting useful life or whatever, but when do we think we're going to have to replace it? How much is it going to cost when we replace it, which of course is not the same as how much we paid for it. And what are the future financial requirements, including rehabilitation and maintenance for the asset and the risks associated with the asset. And Rolando did a good job of talking about criticality and risk. And its location turns out to be remarkably useful, just to have GIS coding in the system. On the screen you see an example of a manual inventory, which might be appropriate for some of the systems on the webinar for facilities in particular, and automated inventory, and that's what we gravitate for the most part when we start trying to manage these assets systematically. Automation of the data collection and the inventory becomes one of the highest priorities. Condition is an inventory item that is somewhat new to the transit industry. To keep a condition rating in the inventory, generally we see people using a 5-point scale, but it's really whatever works for you. The purpose is to be able to talk about the condition of assets regardless of subfleet, fleet, asset grouping, infrastructure. System-wide, you should be able to, with the condition rating, to very quickly prioritize, sequence, and assess the condition of various groups of assets. You'll see on the screen an example of condition rating system that was developed by the State of Good Repair Roundtable that Rolando also mentioned. It divides the condition aspect into 4 categories: asset age, asset condition, asset performance, meaning miles between road calls, failure rates, percent availability, those kinds of performance data, and level of maintenance. Has the maintenance been kept up to date? Is there deferred maintenance, and so forth? And the idea is to rate any individual asset on a 5-point scale in each of those categories. So a 1 on asset age means it's past its useful life, should have been replaced already. A 5 on asset condition means it's like new, no visible defects, and the condition column is normally done through physical observation and physical inspection. Asset performance, a 1 means frequent failures, a 5 means it meets or exceeds the performance standards. Level of maintenance, a 5 means there's no deferred maintenance, and a 1 means that there's significant backlog. And these 4 categories get weighted. So the age score gets weighted 20%, the asset condition gets weighed 30%, the asset performance gets weighed 30%, level of maintenance gets weighed 30%. You'll see at the very last row of the screen, the bottom row of the screen, the scores that were assigned to just an illustrative asset. When they're weighted and added together, they come up to the lower right corner score of 2.70. And then you have noted, just for information, along the right-hand edge of the screen that when FTA has provided 5-point condition ratings in their analysis of the national state of assets, they've used a 2.50 to constitute a state of good repair. So that's one condition rating method that's fairly comprehensive. You all have information, some of this information already. Almost certainly you have age. You could construct probably the maintenance column on this by adding in a periodic observation of the asset, and then utilizing your performance records, you could move towards this rating system from your current data that you have on assets to be able to rate on a 5-point, or Washington DOT uses a 100-point scale. Whatever scale you choose, the condition of the asset, so that you can combine them across asset groups and classes. The third step in the plan is to determine the residual life. Remember, I said keeping an eye on the remaining useful life. And a major question for any asset group that you're evaluating is, what is its real useful life? Let's be clear, we're not talking about the depreciable life necessarily. We're talking about how long should we keep the asset. We're also not talking about the FTA policy life, which they keep as a minimum guideline life before which they really prefer not to fund replacement of the assets that they've funded. It's really a separate question of how long we should keep standard heavy-duty transit bus we know is 500,000 miles or 12 years before FTA wants to replace it. But the Canadian systems typically keep the same buses, according to their national policies, for 18 years. London Transport has a policy of replacing its buses after 3 years because they find the buses they use, the duty cycle they're applying them to, is optimized by replacing buses after 3 years. You see on the screen actually a projection of the useful life for a group of PA systems that was acquired, public address systems. The red X's indicate the failure rate of the systems over time, how many would fail in each year of their useful life. Then the S-curve, the declining S-curve, is a reliability function of the PA systems. And from that reliability function and knowing the cost of replacing the PAs en masse at the end of their useful life versus the cost of replacing PAs as they fail, the asset management analysis resulted in a selection of a 2-year period right around 10 years as the optimal useful life for PA systems based on that engineering data. So this gives you a notion of the engineering analysis that can go into asset management and determining economic useful life. The goal, as we said at the outset, is to minimize the life cycle costs for the assets that are required for the service you targeted. And the life cycle costs include the purchase cost of the replacement asset, the maintenance costs of the asset, and the rehabilitation cost of the asset. And these are the function that we use for optimizing the asset decisions. The most useful metric is annualized life cycle cost. So converting all of these costs into a constant annualized cost, like a mortgage payment for your house, that tells you the annualized cost of providing the assets, including all the life cycle impacts. It's important to know that replacement costs, as I said earlier, are more than purchase costs. They may involve replacement costs during operations. So if you're replacing key parts of an operating facility, you may have to provide temporary facilities. They involve paying for technological improvements that have taken place, so there may be some upgrades in functionality that you need to sort out in your costing process. And you need to look at full versus partial replacement. So buildings you are typically not going to replace in its entirety. This is where your decisions regarding how you build your inventory become particularly useful, so that you can have an inventory that's based on the replacement and rehabilitation decisions that you're going to be evaluating. And of course, you'll have to deal with some regulatory compliance issues, code issues, and ADA issues and so forth when you do replacement, and those all contribute to the replacement cost. So the inventory is a key foundation for the asset management system. Answering the questions on the screen are the basic function of the inventory. We're now going to go on from the inventory steps, which are the first 4 steps in the 10-step process, to step 5, setting quality of service targets. This is a very critical step in this asset management methodology, and it's probably the thing that distinguishes this methodology most from standard practices in the U.S. transit industry. So the International Asset Management Methodology calls for setting quality of service targets, which include safety, they include reliability, they include availability of assets that can become the basis of your maintenance decisions. And those are quality of service targets, sometimes referred to as a quality of service agreement, an agreement you strike with your customers for the quality of service that you will deliver. They answer the question how well the asset should perform, and they set a real boundary, more than our traditional key performance indicators have done in the transit industry. They say this is something we are promising to provide, and falling below this level is not acceptable to the system. In this asset management methodology, it should be noted, going beyond the level of the quality of service agreement is an unnecessary expenditure. And there are real examples of systems that have, following this methodology, have assessed the condition of their assets and have said, we're spending too much money on bus maintenance because the condition of the fleet is too good.
Another, I guess, discriminator from the way we traditionally approach things in the transit industry is how we apply risk in this case. So we stated before that implementing an asset management plan and going through the process of developing a plan is a good business practice. And that is an area where risk comes into play. So here we determine the business risk, which requires an agency to establish a framework, a risk framework that identifies the following. Assessment of risk according to criteria. That's the likelihood of occurrence. So if you fail to maintain a PM schedule, what's the likelihood that a negative occurrence is going to occur? So it's likelihood of occurrence, and then the magnitude of the impact. Interesting, there was a question earlier relating to, I could understand the application of asset management to rolling stock. And in the case of rolling stock, where a vehicle doesn't show up where it's supposed to, when it's supposed to, there's a fair amount of risk and impact associated with that. There is a high level of impact, magnitude of impact. Well, there are other things that are important for that vehicle to show up when it's supposed to show up at that bus stop or that station. And things that are important to the vehicle showing up are part of achieving the performance levels that you've set. So, for example, if you don't have enough operating bus lifts, then you won't be able to properly maintain your equipment so that it can show up at the bus stop and meet the performance requirements that you've set. So there's a significant adverse impact to not having enough lift to maintain the equipment to achieve its purpose. You need to establish a process for assessing risk for each asset, and then establish an asset management actions that can be taken to minimize the agency's exposure to risk. And lastly, establish a process to prioritize the balance of risk against life cycle cost and performance. Now, as we proceed, this is an example of assessing risk, and this is related to financial risk. So if you look over here, the high, that's greater than 25% probability of occurring at a high cost greater than $10 million is represented by 8A. And the low probability, that's less than $100,000 and highly unlikely to occur, is represented by 1D. And the risk assessment process that would be used here is assigning which box that would fall into. So the note here is increase in HVAC usage will cause equipment to fail before life expectancy, causing impact to maintenance budget will require temporary HVAC arrangement. And the determination that was made in assessing that risk was that that represents a 4D risk, which is there is a substantial likelihood of it occurring, but there is a lower than $100,000 impact. Now, bear in mind that this only looks at the financial risk of it. There are potentially other risks that related to failure of HVAC systems that may be rated higher in terms of risk and may cause the agency to take an action to mitigate that risk. So what we'll do, we'll proceed to go to the next two steps, and that is step 7 and step 8 to optimize O&M expenditures and optimize capital investments. Optimizing O&M expenditures. These are your operating and maintenance expenditures, which are an important part of your asset management plan. So to optimize, what you're seeking to do is reach an optimum level relative to investment in O&M against your capital investment. So optimize the PM intervals And then as PM intervals increase, the risk for costs associated with losses also increases. Then the optimum is where the rate of decrease in P&M cost equals the rate of increase in risk. And this table over here shows where that occurs. So on this table, what you're looking at is this here represents the risk exposure. This line, the dashed dotted line, represents the preventive maintenance. Now, the balance point is where those two intersect. That is not necessarily the optimal point. The balance point may have too much cost associated with it or too much risk associated with it. In this case, it would be too much cost associated with it. So it's not necessarily the optimum. The optimum is the point at which the total impact is the lowest. The total impact is the addition of the risk and the preventative maintenance that's added together. That's this line on the top, the solid line on the top, and where that is the lowest is considered the optimum, and that is what you would want to achieve. So that is the point where preventative maintenance expenditures are not necessarily at the lowest, and nor is that the point where the risk exposure is not necessarily at lowest. Again, you're looking for a balance. Determine the capital investment by comparing life cycle costs, including initial capital costs, future maintenance costs, operating costs determined by capital, determined in terms of cost, rehabilitation costs, and replacement costs. So this is how you would determine the optimum capital investment by comparing these life cycle costs. And the next slide is an example of where this was done, and this is a slide based on an actual analysis that was done at an agency. And what the agency proceeded to do was look at how much money it would cost to the cumulative operating and capital cash outflow by bus. And for them, this is only for them. If you look at the chart, you see for this agency, based on their analysis, based on their duty cycle, that it was lower cost for them to proceed to buy a light-duty bus than it would for them to buy a heavy-duty bus. That is not necessarily applicable to every agency. That's only applicable to them. It's also only applicable to them because they've also set performance targets for their agency that is unique to their agency. It is not necessarily applicable to another agency. We proceed to the next step, which is determine the funding strategy, and at this point I'll hand it over to Scott.
Thanks, Bob. So funding strategy is, so to speak, the $64,000 question for transit, because to some extent this issue has gained notoriety and attention because of the backlog that we have not been able to fund. Fortunately, as Rolando described, there are many bus systems and paratransit systems that don't have insurmountable backlogs, and funding is a somewhat more predictable and less challenging process. Nevertheless, funding includes uncertainty, and that needs to be taken into account. But the funding strategy is a basic element of the asset management plan and simply involves the capital renewal and replacement programming that Bob has been talking about, and the maintenance programming, and then matching the funding requirements to the programming needs. And I think that most of us are currently doing, as we said at the outset, a capital plan, and the management plan just needs to integrate all of the funding considerations with the asset management planning process. And that's what's accomplished by Step 9. Step 10 is to document the plan. You see on the screen the outline that the International Infrastructure Management Manual suggests for the outline of an asset management plan. A snapshot of the Ottawa plan covered. We had to go to a Commonwealth country to get a transit asset management plan that roughly got these. They're suggesting a background and description, and then the current and targeted conditions of the asset. So going back to that condition rating and tracking what's been happening and what you're targeting to change in the condition of the asset. And then the heart of the program is the maintenance and capital renewal and replacement program descriptions, the financial requirements, and they're suggesting a commitment to users to finish up the planning document. Implementation processes and organizational issues. This screen shows you the manual suggestion for the functions that should be included in an asset management committee or group that would oversee the asset management improvement process. It suggests that external advisors may be necessary, and particularly that there needs to be a relationship with the top corporate management team, and there needs to be probably from that team near the top of the organization a sponsor for the asset management process. These are some of the titles that we see in transit organizations that relate to the functions that were on the prior slide, but the critical thing is that it needs to be a cross-functional structure that goes across transit departments and includes representation from the key functional areas. Beginning with a pilot is a great idea. If you're focusing on facilities, maybe picking a specific building to start with. Or if you have multiple operating bases, selecting an operating base to start with. But that goes a long way towards showing the rest of the organization, training people, and finding how the process is going to work. Another implementation technique is this plan, do, check, act kind of cycle that we have on the screen for improving your asset management process. And I think it's critical to know that we all are going to start from wherever we find ourselves, but assessing the best practices and identifying and prioritizing gaps between best practices in the industry and our current practices, and then selecting some improvements to be made. It may just be automating the inventory at first, or it may be starting to monitor condition of assets. It may be doing some analysis on some particularly critical renewal decisions that are coming up as to the optimal useful life. Whatever the gaps are that are identified for improvement, going through a cycle of implementing those improvements, and then importantly having an outside, preferably outside review of the process that could be called an audit to inform the next cycle of comparison of practices to industry best practices and selection of improvements. So the asset management plan process incorporated into the methodology that we're talking about focuses on current practices and developing a more advanced level over time. It's an incremental process. Bob showed you a slide showing levels of maturity. Rolando had a similar slide. These advances in levels of maturity occur over decades, not over months. The upper management level support is critical, and making rational business decisions to evaluate your plans and adjust them as you go along is the heart of the process. So we're going to summarize by talking about what transit asset management is again, how it can help you, what's required for implementation, and where you go from here. These are the principles, policy-driven with some buy-in from the top of the organization governing board, performance-based from actual operating results and the availability or reliability of assets, evaluating options and making trade-offs in the maintenance and renewal and replacement decisions you need to make, having a database that you trust to drive those decisions and making it a transparent process so that you can show from data and analysis why the maintenance programs and capital programs are the ones that provide the assets that are necessary at the lowest life cycle cost. So how can it help you? If you're focusing on minimizing the annualized life cycle cost, it clearly reduces the cost of providing assets for transit service. If you're managing that targeted service level, it's going to provide you more consistent performance over time, more consistent miles between road calls, more consistent on-time performance as affected by the asset condition. It's going to provide you more consistent safety based on your managing the safety quality of service and minimizing the cost at the same time. The decision making is more transparent. It therefore allows you to make the case for funding, and there's any number of examples of that, and allows you to take into account analytically agency risk. The requirements for implementation are buy-in from the top, cross-functional participation, and a sustained multi-year commitment to improving your asset management process. We're all going to start from where we are, and we can take pilots or incremental steps to implement asset management process improvement. And this last screen shows you, particularly you can use this if you download the presentation, some references. The FTA site provides the roundtable proceedings that Rolando mentioned, and there are a lot of good papers in there from various transit systems. The International Infrastructure Management Manual is the last cited resource here, and I would recommend the others if you're interested in reading up on asset management.